and gentlemen, hello. I'm Andrew Roberts, the Roger and Martha Mertz Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and I'd like to welcome you to my new podcast, Secrets of Statecraft. Ivn Duque has been president of Colombia since August 2018. In that time, he has fought the FARC guerrilla group and promoted entrepreneurship. One of his passions is history, and I think that comes out very strongly in this conversation. You're one of the world leaders who clearly loves history. Were you taught history well at school? Did you have inspirational history teachers?
Well, Andrew, first of all, it's a great honor for me to be in your podcast. And let me say that my maybe the most important teacher I ever had on history was my father. My father had an amazing library at home, more than 15,000 volumes. He loved history. He loved biographies. And since I was a little kid, he introduced me to the reading of biographies. And we used to have some sort of talks at home where we discussed what we were reading. And my father was voracious in the way he read and the way he analyzed many topics. So it was great to hear from him, but at the same time to read and be able to discuss with him about many, many world affairs, historical affairs. And he had one of his best friends in life was one of the most distinguished historians in Colombia. His name was Abelardo Benavides. And since I was a little kid, he invited me when he went to visit those friends. So I enjoyed those conversations. And I also had the privilege of meeting Eduardo Lemaitre, who's one of the most recognized Colombian historians of all time. He passed away many years ago, but I was also exposed to those kinds of conversations. And maybe since then, I have been a voracious reader. And also I have to say that I'm a voracious reader of Andrew Roberts' books. So I'm so honored of being with you this morning.
Thank you very much indeed. Not to mention myself in the same sentence as Winston Churchill, but you're also a great admirer of Winston Churchill, aren't you? I've known that for some time. What is it about him that you admire the most?
His resilience, because I think that famous phrase that we have seen in many posters, never give up, never give up, never give up. It's maybe the summary of his life. He was a continuous fighter. He fought for his convictions, for his values, for his objectives. He was sometimes perceived as a stubborn, but you have to be sometimes stubborn to let people acknowledge what you really want to express in order to defend a value. So I admire his resilience. He was a leader who embraced many, many crises. And as he said many times, you have to always take advantage of a single crisis, because he was a person who every single time he faced adversity, he was able to turn that adversity into an opportunity. So I admire that from him. The other thing that I admire from him is that he was a voracious writer. He loved to write. He had this idea of recording everything that happened in his public life. And I think that was so important. And the third thing that I liked about him is that he always knew the way he saw his role in the world and the way he captured world events from historical moments to the time he was facing. And that's why his book, the about the history of the English speaking people, it's such an amazing text. The volumes where he recorded that I also admire that for him. And last but not least, I admire his humor and his wit. He had this great capacity to respond to sudden attacks with such a great humor and talent. So for me, he's one of the favorite characters in history.
And does your, with regard to what you were saying about his sense of the past, does your sense of the past and the future affect you in your decision making when you're taking important political decisions for your country? Do you feel the weight of history on your shoulders?
Indeed. And I think there was a great book that I read maybe some 10 years ago that was written by Margaret Macmillan, where Margaret Macmillan talked about the use of history in decision making. So I think it's always very important to look at the moments we face on the present, but always to try to see the similarities with the past, to evaluate what was done in the past. So for example, and I should make this reflection. When we read about what's going on in Ukraine, I think it's always very interesting to read what happened before the World War II, or what happened before World War I, or what happened during the Stalin times with Ukraine, what happened with Ukraine once the Soviet Union came to an end. So it's always good to have those historical recordings, to have an analysis, because at the end, history sometimes repeats itself, but sometimes it repeats differently. But maybe the causes and the solutions that we have seen sometimes in the past have to be also conceived for the present times. So having that historical context is, for me, always a priority. And when I try to figure out the crisis that I have faced as a president, I always try to look back to similar situations in the past in my country's history to identify what was taken into account in the decision-making process. So yes, history for me is something that I see it as something that I love, but I also see history as a very important tool in the current decision-making process.
And with regard to your own country, of course, Simon Bolivar is the father of your country. Do you think he still has lessons to teach you and Colombians today and the wider world? And if so, what are those lessons?
Oh, that's a great question, Andrew, because I think Bolivar is the greatest American of all time. He was not only a great military commander, but he was a true humanist. He was a voracious reader. He loved to write. His letters are impressive, but also the messages he shared with his troops, and also the way he thought about the design and the implementation of our new republic. His speech before the Angostura Congress in 1819, his contribution to the first constitution in 1821, but also the messages he shared to the Peruvian people, the people of the northern part of Peru that later became Bolivia. His messages about having a continental Congress, inviting also President Monroe. So he was a visionary, and he was a fighter. He was a humble man. I mean, although he faced many difficulties in his life, he remained humble in some circumstances, but he was also tough in others. But I think the greatest lesson that we can take from Bolivar is that Bolivar was a true believer in the values of security, liberty, equality, but something that I think resembles also his defense of private initiative. He was a defender of property. And he had this idea of building a republic that will be based on that property idea for everyone, maybe accordingly with the pursuit of happiness that was presented years before by the founding fathers of the United States. He also believed that property and allowing people to become an owner could be something that would close social gaps. And he was a commander that was always teaching by example. He was always in the forefront in the battles. And he was a man that, despite all the privileges that he had in his life, he was humble enough to move with his troops. For example, when the Pisma Paramo was crossed, he was in the front line. He was suffering the same cold that was hitting his soldiers. And he was the man who spent time with them, who got close to their hearts and minds. So I believe that his leadership has to be well recognized. And I told you something that is very important, because I have to say this in this interview. I dreamed that Andrew Roberts one day will write about Simon Bolivar, because there was a member of the British Legion who supported Bolivar for more than 13 years. His name was Daniel Florence O'Leary. And when Bolivar passed away, he recovered all his letters. And all we know about Bolivar was because of Daniel Florence O'Leary's discipline to gather all he wrote, all he said, and made this abundant literature about his contribution to liberty and the inauguration of the Republic.
And there were lots of dangerous moments in that career, weren't there, in Bolivar's career? In your view, what was it about his personality that saw him through those dangerous moments? What do you call the most dangerous moment? And what was it about him that saw him through?
He used to call himself the man of difficulties. When he was born, he lost his father when he was 3 years old. He lost his mother when he was 9. He was raised by an uncle. And, he was basically a self-made man, although, yeah, he came from a wealthy family. But the way he trained himself, the way he saw himself, and when he decided to move on the independence cause after the death of his first wife, or his wife, Maria Teresa del Toro, and he went to France and to Spain to let his sentiments flow and try to regain confidence in himself. And when he takes a decision of going back and fighting for liberty, he had that tremendous endurance. And later on, he lost his brother, who was his closest member of the family. So he faced many, many difficulties. But maybe as Churchill did, out of every difficulty, he came out with more strength, with more power, and also with the capacity to see beyond the evident. That I think that was his most important quality. And I should say this, Bolivar was the man who conceived, although he had all the powers, and he could have taken all the powers for a long time, he decided to create a republic based on the 3 division of power, and based also under the premise that the presidential power should have a lasting period and to have a succession process that would allow the republic to evolve. So I see him as one of the greatest Republicans of all time.
He's obviously had a tremendous effect on your career. You've had tremendous difficulties that you've had to face in your times. Have there been any times in your life, your career, when you've looked at the painting of Bolivar in your office and thought to yourself, what would he have done?
Well, moments that I have lived and that I learned from Bolivar is always being close to the troops. That you have to guide the troops, but you have to inspire the troops, but at the same time, you have to get close to their hearts and minds. So during many moments of difficulty in the fights against terrorism, and when we have had very complex circumstances of public order, in those moments, I think Bolivar expressions made an influence on me, because when I regularly travel to another city in Colombia, I sleep in the battalions. I wake up early and I say hi to the troops. I shake their hands. I get the possibility to dialogue with many of them, of the soldiers. And also in moments of crisis, I've tried to be close to them and orient them under the premise that this is a democracy and that we have to defend the values and human rights, but also being close to them. So that's maybe one. Another one that I would mention as an influence is, even in the harder times, you have to be able to let your soul get a new momentum. And Bolivar had many setbacks in his political career. He had setbacks of legislative order. He had setbacks on military order. But once a setback came, he rode and he got to push his spirit up again. And that's when I feel how we embrace the pandemic, Andrew, and how Colombia today has one of the fastest growing economies in the world after the pandemic, and how we have reached record highs in vaccination levels, even above developed countries. And when we looked about the recovery of employment levels, and when we think about the energy transition that we did in the midst of the pandemic and the sales of low-income housing, I think that spirit of being able to fight back and be able to keep on moving on your ideals and objectives is something that I certainly feel Bolivar's influence. And I should say this, that I'm going to leave the presidency in August, and with all due humbleness, by 2030, when it will be 200 years of Bolivar's passed away, I want to publish a biography on those 200 years. So I'm going to start working on that, and it'll take me 8 years to try to do something that is rigorous enough to get into that piece of his decision-making process and get more on the historical figure, on the human being that called himself the man of difficulties.
Wow, that's extraordinary. You're going to, after you retire, you're going to write a history book. That's fabulous. Congratulations. There are very few world leaders who do that. And And so it's splendid that you're going to. How important do you think is a sense of the past in politics? There are some people who say that politicians only should look to the future because the past, everything's changed so much in history that the past doesn't provide a real guide.
One of my favorite characters in history has been Nicolas Machiavelli. And Niccolo Machiavelli sometimes has been demonized as the incarnation of evil, but he was a true Republican. And he wrote many interesting books. And I think Beyond the Prince, that is the one that everybody talks about regularly in politics. I think his discourses on the decades of Livy was, in my opinion, one of the greatest books of the Florence Renaissance. And what I got from reading Machiavelli is that you cannot really be a statesman if you don't have a conscience of the past, and if you don't have the value of history, and if you don't understand what happened in history, because what we are is a byproduct of the past, and it's a byproduct of historical moments. So history, in my opinion, is not only a tool, but I think it's maybe the most important tool, because in order to understand the circumstances of today, we have to know what happened in the past, not to reply what happened in the past, not to replicate what happened in the past, but be able to understand what the causes and effects of certain circumstances were. So history, in my opinion, it's something that I have to keep close. When I was studying public administration some years ago in Georgetown, I remember that I had a book that was called Thinking in Time. And what was interesting about that book is about government decision-making based on the analysis of historical moments. So, for example, what happened in the missile crisis in the early 60s? Can we bring lessons from that to the situations we face today between the United States and Russia? Certainly. It's different. Circumstances might be different, but the essence can be of a very important use. When we think about what happened when the Soviet invasion to Czechoslovakia, can we take lessons from that and understand the moments we live? Can we take lessons from Vietnam in the way that we see the current circumstances in Ukraine? Can we take lessons from what happened in Afghanistan? Definitely. Can we take lessons of what happened in Iraq? So I think those elements of history are so important and pivotal that if you ask me, what would be the number one class that, in my opinion, any person who wants to become a public servant should take, definitely is history. And before I run for the presidency, I used to teach his political history of civilizations, and sometimes I was actually struck because maybe some of the new generations, they don't have such a good knowledge about history. And sometimes I think that the idea of privileging mathematics and science and English and languages, or even media and programming, has left history behind. And I think that is a flaw that we have sometimes in the education system. So we definitely have to bring back this and make history a very important tool and the most important element of reflection.
I'm so pleased you said that. That one of the reasons actually this podcast is called Secrets of Statecraft is because of Winston Churchill, who told a young American who was asking for some life advice, he said, study history, for therein lies all the secrets of statecraft. And so it's wonderful to hear a worldly leader like you expounding the importance of history. And what do you think future historians will say about you and about your career in 100 years' time? And do you care what the verdict of history is long after you're dead? It's an interesting. I suspect from what you've already said, I know the answer to that. But do expound a bit.
But it's a great question, Andrew. It's a great question, and I don't mean to flatter you, but I have to say that something that I admire from your books is that you have written with rigorosity. On your latest book on Churchill, and I think that's the great contribution, is that you go to the source, you go to the speeches, you go to the parliament proposals. So the first thing that I want to leave as part of the legacy is to have a well-documented government. Because if you don't have a well-documented government, then the way that history will judge your government will be determined maybe by the biases of those who will write history later on. So I think having a clear documentation of all that we achieved is very important. And that's why I have so many notebooks, handwritten, and decisions that I've made that are all documented. I'm actually building a set of books for personal use of the day to day, every single day of my administration, what happened. So that's issue number one, having a well-documented government. And then when I think history will judge what we did, I think there are 5 elements that will be always in the conscience of those who will evaluate what happened between 2018 and 2022 in Colombia. The number one is what we did with the migrants. For the first time in Latin American history, dealing with the most complex migration crisis, instead of letting xenophobic sentiments arise, we decided to create a temporary protection status to 1.8 million migrants, something that is the biggest, maybe, peace gesture in Latin American recent history. The second element is that the government that made the biggest social expenditure in Colombian history is our government. And we did it to face the pandemic, but also to pull the economy back from the resentment that the pandemic left. So growing 10.6%, the highest economic growth registered by now in historical terms, is something that has a value, but also expanding the social safety net in a way. And that takes me to the third element, to leave free public higher education for the lowest income families and the emerging middle class is also a major contribution. And the way that we have dealt with climate change, that's the fourth element. We launched the first bill on climate action that was approved unanimously, and that goes hand in hand with the energy transition, that goes hand in hand with the protection of oceans. Having 30% of the Colombian land declared a protected area is also something that history will record. And the fifth element, Andrew, that I feel very proud is that we have been the government that has made the largest investment in infrastructure ever. And we're leaving the most important infrastructure project in Colombia's history, which is the cross of the Central Mountain Corridor, that for 100 years was the dream of many presidents, and we were able to give it to the Colombian people. So those 5 elements, I could mention some more, but those 5 elements, in my opinion, should be judged. And maybe I'll finish with this. I have been the youngest president in Colombia elected, and I have dealt with the most complicated crisis in Colombian history, that was the COVID-19 crisis. And I think when people will evaluate how the youngest president was able to navigate that storm and pull the economy back again and be able to vaccinate the whole country, that is, in my opinion, something that I would love history to record and evaluate about myself.
Well, I hope in 100 years' time people will listen to this podcast and will listen to what you've said and be suitably affected and impressed. Tell me, this is last question, and the one that I ask all of my guests. What history book or biography are you reading at the moment?
I have a good set of books in my desk at this moment. So on history, I'm actually reading a book that was written by a former colleague of mine in the Senate who passed away, and he left his memoirs. So that's like a Colombian history book that I have closed.
What's his name?
I am rereading a book that was written by Maurizio Viroli on Machiavelli, that is called Machiavelli's God. So I have also that on my desk. But I have
Sorry, who is the
a
who
book
is
that
the
I haven't
senator?
started yet
You
about
mentioned-
the Watergate scandal that just came out. I brought it from Washington 2 weeks ago, from 2 weeks ago, and the other book that I have in my backpack is a book about it's called The Nature of Nature. It's written by Enrique Sala, who's an explorer in residence of National Geographic. So he talks about biology and how we should embrace the climate action crisis involving the protection of biodiversity. So those are the books that I have now in my bookshelf.
They very much count. What's the name of the senator who you?
Horacio Serpa. Horacio Serpa. So he published a book that is called The Country That I Lived. And that I think it's an interesting contribution because he was president at the moment, so it's a good history book, and I have George the Third book that I got some months ago. So I'm trying to interconnect that book with the other readings that I have. So I should say, Andrew, that this is my lowest reading of Andrew Roberts because of my daily work, but I have to say that I'm enjoying it a lot.
That question was not intended as an advert, but thank you very much indeed. President Ivn Duque of Colombia, thank you very much indeed for coming on Secrets of Statecraft.
Thank you so much, Andrew. It has been a great honor, and I have to say this live that you're invited to come to Colombia. We want you to be here, and I want you to get you interested on Simón Bolívar because I know you're going to love the character.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. President. Thank you for listening to my conversation with President Duque of Colombia. In my next conversation, I'll be speaking to Peter Robinson, Ronald Reagan's speechwriter, and the man who wrote these famous words.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Until then, goodbye.
This podcast is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we advance ideas that define a free society and improve the human condition. For more information about our work, or to listen to more of our podcasts, or watch our videos, please visit hoover.org.
Until then, goodbye.